Today we're going to talk about how high your blade should be while you're cutting wood with your table saw. This is a very controversial subject. I'm going to tell you what the blade manufacturers recommend you do. I'm going to show you some things that can occur as to how you decide to set your own blade. And at the end of this, we're all going to set our blades where we want to set our blades. But I'll point out some good issues. I'll point out some issues that you may be having and why you may be having them. Hi everybody, I'm Jim Dirdorf and this is Detroit DIY. Let's get going. Now that we're up close and personal with the blade, I just want to point a few things out. This is how a lot of people set their blade, where there is very minimal blade raised above the workpiece. And the reason for that being is that everyone says that you just barely want the blade to break through the workpiece, so that if anything goes wrong, that the blade basically can cut you very minimal. But that's not always the case, and this is not always how the blade should be set. So let me get into that. This is an 80 tooth fine cut blade, and as you can see, this very last carbide right here, the angle that it's on as it's leaving the piece of wood, this is referred to as the hook or the rake, is the angle that this is coming out of. Now I just recently cut this piece of material, and as you can see, there is no tear out, and I am not using a zero clearance throat plate. And the reason is because of the angle of this tooth right here as it's exiting the material. The other thing about cutting a piece of wood with the blade like this that I want to point out is that the carbides are almost all of them rubbing on the edge of this piece of wood. If you're cutting your wood and you're getting some burn marks on the side of your wood, it could be because of your choice to run your blade where you're running it at. Because of those carbides all rubbing on the side of this blade, it can create a lot of heat. So the gullets are these little valleys in between each carbide. The manufacturers of this saw blade say that we should be using this blade with the height right there, so that the bottom of the gullet is at the top of your workpiece. Now, if you've noticed, that changed the angle at which this is going to leave out. It still has the correct angle. In fact, this is the angle that the manufacturer intended for this blade to exit the thickness of your workpiece by having the gullet exposed. So these gullets are here for two reasons. One is to carry away the wood chips, and it's basically going to dump them after it cuts. So when the blade comes back up, it may still be carrying a few wood chips, but now the purpose of these gullets is to collect air, the air that cools the blade. And because it's raised above the workpiece, it can collect air, and when it comes back through and it collects the wood and spits it out, fresh air wood, fresh air wood, that helps to keep this blade cool. So if you're experiencing some burning on the sides of your workpiece, it's not necessarily that your blade is dull, it's because the blade is not being allowed to cool the way that it should. You're not carrying any air in with these gullets. So let's raise this blade up a little higher, because I kind of want you to see what happens with the exit angle of the carbide on the blade. So the higher we raise this up, you can already see the exit angle is changing. In fact, here the carbide is almost parallel to the piece of wood as it's exiting. It's no longer has the same pitch that it did. My blade is all the way up right now. If I was to cut this strip with my blade all the way up like this, I would experience a great deal of tear out, because this carbide is cutting it so much more aggressively than what the manufacturer intended. So the thing is, this is important to understand, because if you want to alter what your saw blade is doing and the way that it's cutting the wood, you can raise and lower the blade to alter the hook and the rake of this blade to get either a more positive or a more negative pitch on the carbide as it's exiting your workpiece. Now, I have to say, even me, myself, rarely ever do I raise the blade up where the gullet is exposed in the way that the manufacturer would actually say that this is how you set the blade up. I drop the blade down where it's just barely protruding through the wood. But there's been some material that I've cut where I have burnt the side of it. And if I make my first cut and I see that the side is burnt, that's really not desirable. I will go ahead and raise the blade up to get the gullet to carry some more air through. Maybe not as high as where the entire gullet is exposed, but at least where it's partially exposed so that it can scoop some air and help to keep this blade cool. And notice that the burning goes away. I just want to add, guys, that I want you to set your saw blade wherever you feel comfortable setting it. There is no real sense to raise a saw blade way up. While yes, the less carbide you have contacting your workpiece as you're feeding it through, it reduces the chances of a kickback. The carbides are what's rubbing on the wood. The carbides are what's trying to push the wood back out of the saw as you're cutting it. So the less carbide you have rubbing on the wood, the less your risk of a kickback. That's just known. I mean, if you were to have this blade all the way up and cut a piece of 3/4 inch material, there's nothing wrong with that. And if it weren't for the fact that the blade was sticking way up here, it would probably be the safest way to cut a thin strip of wood, other than the fact that you have so much blade exposed, only because there's so few carbides actually contacting the wood. Alright guys, that's all we got for this time. If you haven't subscribed yet, I would greatly appreciate it if you would consider doing so. I'd really appreciate it if you guys would jump down in the comments and tell me what you think, or where you like to set your blade on your table saw, or even if you haven't used a table saw but you're thinking about getting one. If you enjoyed yourself, click on one of those two videos that are going to pop up next to me, and remember to always respect the power of your power tools. We'll see you soon.